there. This is another episode of our famous conversations on classical music called Pro and Fan. It's cool that you tuned in again. I'm Andreas, based in Zurich, and on the other side of the ocean, there is my friend David, based in Philadelphia. And David is going to explain to you what we've thought of communicating to you today.
Yeah. So hi, everybody. It's famous conversations in our own households. We're going to continue with our macabre death march here. So we have three stories for you. One I would characterize as bizarre, the other one as mysterious, and the third one as just bad luck, tragic. So we'll start with the first one, the bizarre one, right? So it involves Jean-Baptiste Lully. Jean-Baptiste Lully was born Giovanni Battista in Florence. When he was 14 years old, he was on the streets of Florence during Mardi Gras, wearing a harlequin suit and playing the violin, and a French nobleman happened to see him and approached him and said, I have a daughter who needs somebody to practice Italian with and also music, and so would you like to come as a servant, essentially, into my household in Paris? And little Giovanni, 14 years old, said, sure, why not, right? And off he goes to Paris. And there he continues to pursue music education, and turns out that he was a good dancer, a particularly good dancer. And so he joined some royal ballet troupe, and in it, while performing, he met another performer who happened to be the future Louis XIV. And so they struck a friendship, and when Louis XIV became the Sun King, he started promoting who was then became Jean-Baptiste Lully. And to his merit, I mean, Jean-Baptiste Lully was an accomplished composer and quite a revolutionary. He introduced Italian-style opera into Paris. You know, he ended up being the court composer. He was a favorite of Louis XIV. While he obviously was quite charming, he also was very much appreciative and demonstrated his power granted by the king. And so his reputation among his peer musicians was not a favorable one. I mean, he was clearly disliked by most people who worked with him, even though he was a very accomplished guy. So this is all the prelude, the background to the actual story we're going to tell. And the actual story starts with him conducting a Te Deum, piece that he composed, in gratitude for Louis XIV recovering from some illness. And people were not conductors
exactly.
at the time.
That's the point.
You can explain that better since you were relevant.
No, because actually, if you're so familiar today with the appearance of a conductor, you know, swinging his baton against the orchestra, that you forget actually that in this form, this is an invention of the 19th century, and rather the second half of the 19th century. And before that, the orchestras were not called orchestras, but rather chapels. And so the conductor was rather a chapel master, or master of, in this case, of the royal chapel. And a conductor had to play actually an instrument while leading. And then only, actually, this was already a next step or a side step, so to say, that they, for a short period only, they used, instead of a small baton, waved through the air, through thin air, they used a long baton and banged it. So you had a strong bang on wooden floors with a long baton.
and those, those kind of masks were quite heavy, and so during this performance, Lully got a little carried away, and he was banging the tempo on the floor, and one of those times he just kind of banged himself.
It's amazing. Poor guy. I mean,
banged pretty hard actually, but he was a trooper, and he kind of continued even though he was in horrible pain, and he apparently gashed his foot, and as you can tell, probably whatever little daintily shoe he was wearing, Baroque style.
Yeah,
wasn't very protective, and
not modern safety.
It wasn't very clean.
Yeah, right? And I mean, not modern safety standards. Certainly, I mean, today you wouldn't be allowed to use such a baton without safety shoes.
Right. Yeah, correct. So anyway, so his foot got infected, and he refused treatment, and then he got gangrene in it, and it started spreading, and he was advised by his physicians that they had to amputate his leg, otherwise he would die. And so he famously said, "I would rather die than not being able to dance," and died he did. So there he goes.
Yeah.
Actually, another story that has some similar elements involves Maria Malibran. So very, very quickly, Maria Malibran was a superstar opera singer in the 19th century. I mean, she was one of the few truly international stars. She was famed for her temperament and beauty and voice, of course,
and technique. I mean, voice technique. I mean, she was actually one crucial chain element of the transmission of the voice technique from 19th century until our days.
And she actually composed a few pieces herself. So she was bright, and she was talented, and she was beautiful, and she was temperamental. And one day she gets thrown out of her horse. She has a horseback riding accident, and she again refuses treatment and goes on and insists on keep performing at a pretty exhausting pace, and until she basically collapsed and died. And she was only 28 years old.
Yeah, it's amazing. But I mean, on the other hand, you really must say probably that medical treatment at that time was rather risky.
Yeah. Anyway, another little tragic story. And then we have a mysterious one.
Yes, a famous composer. I mean, I think to this day, he's one of the most played composers in classical music. Pyotr Ilyich Tchaikovsky, the famous Russian composer. Pyotr Ilyich Tchaikovsky started his career not right away as a musician, but he studied law, and he even had some years as a civil servant before deciding that music was his actual destiny. At the time he died, he was 53. I thought of that just today because it's my age. So I think I can relate to his general feeling of his point in life. But anyway, he was a very sensitive person in any case. I mean, really, not only in his music, but also in his personal feelings. And he was, I think you can say that openly, although we don't have, direct proof in that sense, but he was homosexual. At least he felt, maybe he was attracted also to women to a certain extent, but I think erotically and probably also sexually, he was clearly rather attracted to men. He, by the way, also had a tragic episode of a marriage with a woman, and otherwise he remained a bachelor throughout his life. We don't know if he had real affairs, but it was known that he was attracted to men, and in particular also younger men. And then at the end of his life, he composed his 6th symphony. And shortly after the premiere of his 6th symphony, he died of cholera.
Yeah, 9 days. So officially, he died of cholera. The official story was that he drank tap water at a well-known restaurant, and he died from that. Most people believe that's nonsense for a number of reasons. One is the high society in Russia were all very aware of the cholera problem. They all took steps to drink only boiled water. They wouldn't have given him untreated tap water at a famous restaurant. And by the way, they say that he was a very fastidious person as far as his appearance and his hygiene. So it kind of makes no sense.
No, I absolutely agree. The thing is, or the big question is, did he do it intentionally? And you may know the famous, there is a really a wonderful novel by Klaus Mann, the son, also homosexual son of the Nobel Prize winner Thomas Mann. And this Klaus Mann wrote a novel on the life of Tchaikovsky, and being a homosexual himself, although living in the early 20th century, and by the way, in the end also killing himself. He killed himself shortly before the end of World War II in Cannes, this Klaus Mann, and he wrote the Symphonie Pathétique is the title of this novel. And now to your point, and he also imagined that Tchaikovsky intentionally asked for a glass of tap water instead of drinking mineral water.
Yeah, I mean, it's possible. There's also a theory, by the way, that his symptoms were more akin to arsenic poisoning.
Exactly,
as opposed to cholera. And the fact that his body was exposed, that lends credence to that.
Now comes the mystery. He himself thought of his Sixth Symphony as his requiem. So you could really say his summary of life and his farewell. Because, as you know, it's a very unusual symphony. It starts slowly and it ends slowly. It ends really with a death chorale, and it fades out into nothingness. So he composed his requiem and then he died. Now, did he kill himself by drinking tap water, infected water? Did he do that by himself? Or, and now comes an even more mysterious theory, did a circle of the Petersburg, I think it was, an elite group of society threatened him to offer him the choice: either you kill yourself or we'll, expose your sexual desires. And so therefore, kill, actually at this time, end of 19th century, very few people could live a gay life openly without, being shamed by the wider societies.
The story, as I know it, is that there seemed to have been a court of honor, that's the way they called it, by his fellow members of the Imperial School of Jurisprudence. Like, he was a member as a lawyer, and his fellow members of the Imperial School of Jurisprudence basically called him to a meeting and gave him this ultimatum. And there are accounts where he left the meeting very distressed and pale and didn't want to talk to anybody about it. And so there's some accounts that lend credence to that story. So the intriguing one is whether he was basically forced to kill himself.
Exactly. But, still what strikes me is, we know as a fact he finished his Requiem Symphony, the sixth one, by his own will. He was because the sketches and the idea to compose this symphony clearly must have started much earlier than any court of honor. So my theory is actually that even if such a court of honor took place in reality, he was ready to die. He was a very accomplished, society person. He could have easily conversations. He also spoke perfectly French. He was, I think, even a very, very remarkable German. So he was really a figure of the society who could really.
He was very attractive too. He was an attractive person.
Yeah, he was attractive even in his early 50s, and but at the same time he suffered constantly. He felt more at ease when he was for himself or in the society of, for example, his nephew, whom he adored. So, and there he goes and writes his own Requiem symphony. And now, so my theory is he was on his way to prepare himself to die. And then even if this other circumstance, cut through that original plan, or if it was his own will, I think he was ready. Then this mystery remains unsolved, but I think if you listen to his Sixth Symphony, you will completely understand that he had no hope left for life.
Yeah, I think that the point I take from all that is it's remarkable when you think about Tchaikovsky as Russia's national treasure. I mean, by far the most famous Russian composer, one of the most famous Russians who ever lived. And yet, society norms at the time, which today seem ridiculous, forced him to kill him, to take his life, which is really an incredible testament to how society was then and how it has evolved. So moving on to the next one, but maybe before a little detour. So there's another famous Russian composer who died in kind of unusual circumstances. So Alexander Borodin, he died by literally getting a heart attack and dropping dead in the middle of a dance, the other party. Ironically, at the medical school, or the Society of Physicians in Russia. So you have the lawyers on the one hand, the doctors on the other hand, and there he drops dead in the middle of that, surrounded by doctors, none of whom was able to do anything about it.
I'm sorry. I mean, I must really say I'm not laughing at his death. I mean, because death is always something terrible. But while you were, telling this story, there is always one anecdote I like so much of Borodin, because as you may know, or you certainly know, he was a chemist. He was really, I mean, you could say he was a hobby componist. I mean, he did remarkable things, the Prince Igor opera and other famous stuff. But I mean, he was really, he
was a very accomplished scientist.
Yeah, so he was an accomplished chemist and also tried to compose, and in many cases succeeded. But I mean, what I wanted to tell is, and this is for me so typical of Borodin, because he was apparently, as a human being, he was all the time really the distracted, intellectual. And so, and he also, he liked, like, this is a cliche, but there is some truth to it. He liked to drink and to party, definitely. And then there was this, and this is really reported by many sources, then there was this a really huge party, big party, intense party at his own house, so at Borodin's house. And he drank and he enjoyed himself. And then at whatever, 2 o'clock, 3 o'clock, 4 o'clock in the morning, he got dressed, took his hat and left the house, only to realize after a few steps that the party was taking place at his own house.
Yeah, that's a good story.
I like that so much.
He wasn't alone in drinking, by the way. We told the story of Glazunov being like totally drunk when he was conducting.
And by the way, also Tchaikovsky, I mean, yes, amazing. But I mean, and by the way, I admit, before we started this conversation, to tune in, I had a glass of vodka, and and the cucumber, like you do in Russian.
Right. Well, you prepare for this better than I did. I had no vodka at all. All right. So moving on to our third story, and which is really a very tragic story, but also we intended to highlight this composer in telling you the story because I think he's not that well known, but he wrote very beautiful music. I'm talking about the Spanish composer Enrique Granados, who is famous for his Goyescas, but he wrote a lot of beautiful piano music and other music, and it's somewhat underrated nowadays. But in his time, he was actually quite a well-known composer and pianist. He was a very accomplished pianist. And, you know, he was known all over the world, and he toured, and he was invited to give some recitals in New York, including a recital for President Wilson. So he comes to New York, and he gives the recital, and then he was supposed to come back, return to Spain by boat, of course. This is, 1916. And he was lured into giving yet another recital, which he did, and that caused him to miss his boat. And so he had to take an alternative boat to England. And then from England, he was crossing the channel to France, and I guess presumably then going, by land back to Spain. Well, on the way from England to France, aboard a ship called the SS Sussex, the ship was torpedoed by the Germans. This is during the U-boat period in World War I. And here's the series of misfortunes that happened to the guy. First, he missed his boat. Then he got into the wrong boat. Then when the boat was torpedoed, it hit only one part of the boat. So half the boat was unharmed, and his cabin was in the part that was intact. So he would have survived, like many people in that area, but he happened to be the wrong side of the boat when that happened, right? So then that side of the boat gets evacuated, except that he was with his wife Amparo, and his wife was a pretty heavy-set woman, and so they would not let her into the rescue boat because she was just too big. And so he refuses to let her go, and they put her in I guess by all accounts seemed to be like a little raft, like a piece of wood, where she was like sitting there, and he was holding on to it, and within minutes, that capsized, and she goes under, and he dives after her, trying to rescue her, and they both die. Right. So
it has almost Titanic, so to say, Titanic dimensions.
It does. Yeah. I mean, there's like the bad luck, the heroism. I mean, it's just a very unfortunate event. Taking him in his prime, really, and they left behind 6 children.
Yeah, that's the tragedy also.
Ironically, one of them, his namesake, Enrique Granados Jr., I guess, was a champion swimmer. And we'll come back with a different topic next time.
With a different topic, and what I always hope, and I think what we both hope and intend with our episodes, is to bring closer to our audience those people, because they were human beings who had human feelings, had a special gift. But I think always, if you know some details about their lives, you also get more attached to their music. So in this sense, I hope we succeeded, and thanks everybody for listening. And now please go out and listen to the music.
Bye.
Bye.
Goodbye for now.
Bye.